So I think the real estate market needs to cool down. And I want to go into detail about what that means because I'm sure when a lot of people hear that, alarm bells go off in the head. They think crazy things are afoot because, for the most part, people don't talk about that. And, well, people will talk about it, but they'll talk about it in not a realistic way, let's say. So, my name is Michael Lentz. I'm running for mayor of Coeur d'Alene. You can see more about me at Strong Young Mayor on Instagram or strongyoungmayor.com. And obviously, I'm doing these YouTube videos so people can get a feel for who I am, why I'm running, what my motivations are, and really what I want to do as mayor of Coeur d'Alene, which is all centered around keeping Coeur d'Alene special. I want Coeur d'Alene to remain how it is. So a big portion of my view on that is that in order for the city to remain special, and I did a whole series on growth. You can see part 1 through 4 if you really want to watch. It's pretty in depth, where I feel like I make a pretty reasonable argument for my positions. But I wanted to very quickly go over what it means to cool down the real estate market because I'm sure that that's going to, it's fairly abstract, to be fair. So what does that mean? So typically when developers are getting zoning changes, building permits, these types of things, they will say, I've heard them say in several city council meetings, that, well, the demand is so high that we need to increase the supply to fulfill the demand. So we need extra units. We need a zoning change. We need this permit to build 1 million apartments, whatever it is. And that is, in part, how supply and demand works. The sleight of hand that I feel like a lot of that is if, for example, there's a demand for people to, like right now, there's a demand for lower end rentals, and there's a demand for people who want to buy houses at, let's say reasonable prices, people who have lower to middle types of incomes. And that's not any sort of slight against them. There's a lot of people who make under $20 an hour who work very hard and they work honest jobs. They need to live here too. So currently, judging from the rental market, from what I can see, pretty much you have to make $22 to $23 an hour or you basically cannot live here. Outside of a few circumstances, or if you can wait for an apartment to be available by December, or if you want to live in some sort of shared room situation, that's possible. But if you have a family, have a spouse, that sort of thing, have any kids, and you make under $23 an hour currently, you cannot afford to live here. So part of that, a big part of what's happening, so the real estate market has gone way up. I'll give you an example. According to Redfin data, the real estate market in the United States, let me pull that up real quick. The real estate market in the United States, the median sale price in the last 5 years has gone from $251,000 to currently $380,000. That's an increase in the median sale price for the country of roughly just a little over 50%. Now, the market here in Coeur d'Alene has gone in the last 5 years in terms of median sale price from $250,000. So it was basically at the national average 5 years ago to $550,000. So that's an increase of over 100%. Or relative to the national average, it's a 45% increase on top of the national average. Now, looking here at the data on Redfin, for example, year over year, it's saying that the median sale price has gone up 31% and the number of homes sold has gone down 29%. So for realtors, for example, I'm sure realtors will hear, the market's going to cool down. That's not going to be good. But if the market cools down, house prices go down and you sell more houses, theoretically, you should be getting paid roughly the same. Because at least as I understand it, let's say if you did $10 million in sales, it doesn't matter if you, on the whole, if you do that over 20 properties or 30 properties, you're doing 10 million in sales, you're going to get that commission off of the $10 million. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the earnings would be similar. So let me just make sure we're good here. Okay. So there's supply and demand. And part of the problem with this adding supply argument is that everything that gets built doesn't necessarily affect the demand. Another example, they're building $1.6 million houses by the new Atlas Park. Those $1.6 million houses are not going to do anything for local workers here. They're not going to do anything for anybody making a livable wage here in Coeur d'Alene. They're not going to do anything for the rental market. There's going to be people who are imported to the area to buy those $1.6 million houses. So the idea that anything built, those $1.6 million houses, are somehow affecting the demand I don't think that's real. So, luxury apartments, $1.6 million houses, those are not affecting, it's not a supply issue. It's not like the city doesn't have enough of those. The other issue is, like I mentioned in another video, there's 12 tiny houses across the street that have all been rented for $2,000 a month. Though a project like that also doesn't really affect the supply that much because there's not really a demand in the area for $2,000 a month rentals. There is in the fact that there's not rentals that are less than that, but there's not a huge higher end job earning economy here, like in a place like Seattle where you have tech workers making $200,000 a year, where the demand for rentals like that is very high. The demand for rentals at $2,000 a month, yes, they get filled because there's nothing else, but that doesn't really affect the demand. If there was lower priced rentals, then there's not really going to be a demand for those types of rentals. So I think there's a lot of sleight of hand in the way that all of these different luxury apartments, $1.6 million houses are being built, these crazy rentals across the street, and using the justification that those are somehow affecting the supply and demand. In a very minimal way, maybe. For $1.6 million houses, not at all. So the issue is, as I mentioned, if you make less than $23 an hour right now, you pretty much cannot afford to live or find a place in Coeur d'Alene unless you want to start packing multiple people in a house, which doesn't work if you have a spouse or a family. So how can we affect the supply and the demand? The other way outside of increasing the supply, which by the way, that's the point here, is that if demand is not addressed, then fixing it with supply becomes inevitable. That's the choice, right? Supply and demand. So if the income required to live here keeps going up, as it will as the rental market goes up, with the housing market going up, then addressing that supply is going to become necessary as time goes on. And I detail that in my other video. So what do I mean by cooling down the market? I mean by reducing the demand. And there are several ways that you can do that. You can think about, this works in a bad sense a lot of times because people think about it as, well, the government gets involved in the market and therefore it makes the market unattractive. And in part, that's true. And that's what I want to do. I want to make it unattractive to outside investors, hedge funds, outside corporations and businesses. So the way that you do that is by taxing them in large part. So, or by creating difficult environments or restricting what types of behaviors that they can do. So for example, maybe you have to sneeze, no. For example, if we had a limit on VRBOs, vacation rental by owners, if we had a limited number of licenses, and let's say that they're like liquor licenses. And also, let's say all of this with the caveat that the mayor's not a dictator, the mayor's not a legislator. Obviously, you have to get everybody in the room involved. You have to be talking to a lot of people, work things out. I obviously have the ideas. I'm willing to start the conversation, but the exact way that these things come into place will obviously be decided on a lot of factors, city council, other different people that would have to come in. But I'm willing to bang the drum, start the conversation, and make the proposal. For example, what if, and also that I'd have to consult the city attorney, make sure these things are legal, etc. But let's say, for example, that VRBO licenses are like liquor licenses where there's a limited number of them and they're tied to the house where they're at, or they're sellable when the house is sold, or just sellable generally, but there's a limited number. And as a tourist town, we decide what that number is. The city comes up with a number. So let's say this rough example, city comes up and says, okay, we want, because allegedly right now, 5% of the total supply of houses in Coeur d'Alene, I forget where I heard this. I'm just being honest that I've heard it, but I forget where. So take it with a grain of salt, as I will. But I've heard 5% of the city's housing inventory is VRBOs. So let's say we come up with whatever number of VRBOs that we want. And we say, well, you have to have this license in order to operate a VRBO. Because right now, if you live in California or wherever, you can just, hey, if you're making $1 million a year, why wouldn't you buy a VRBO here, make your mortgage in rental, and get 30 to 40% equity year over year? Why wouldn't you do that? Makes sense to me. I mean, that's just a smart investment. Why? I don't understand why you wouldn't do that. Easy money. You don't have to do anything. Let a property management company manage it. You dump the money in for whatever it is. Boom. You make 30% year over year or more. So that's obviously taking some inventory off of the market. And it's also taking some economic growth that we would like to keep here and sending it to California. That rent money goes to California or Washington or Dubai or London, doesn't matter where. California is just a shorthand because there's lots of Californians, and there's lots of wealthy Californians who are doing this. But let's say if we had VRBO licenses limited and we decide, okay, we're only going to have 2,000 of those. I'd even love to have a way that could be weighted towards giving those licenses to locals. Let's say, you have to be a resident of Idaho to even, for 80% of the licenses are reserved for people in Idaho. 90, I don't know, whatever. We can have a small amount of outside investors, but it's capped. Once you cap that and put it within the license, number one, you're generating revenue from the license. But number two, you're eliminating that demand from outside investors coming in to buy a VRBO. If they can't get a license and therefore can't rent the house, then that ends the demand of them buying a rental here. So then with the demand going down, the prices theoretically should even out and come down. That's one example. You can do multiple things, Airbnb licenses. I would like to have some rent controls, or at least explore that option. And I mean that in terms of how much landlords are able to increase rents and how much rents are allowed to be, because you can't have, again, this is your choice as the voter, what you would like. I'm the guy who wants the small town lifestyle. The other two that I'm running against are unlimited profits, but you can't have rentals going up 30% or 50% year over year and not have government subsidized housing. Inevitably, you will get government subsidized housing, Section 8, big buildings of studio apartments. I am very against that. And so the way you have to do that is by lowering the demand in the market. By making rentals less attractive, you make less people invest in real estate as a rental business, which means you have more inventory for people to buy. And you have the inventory spreads out more. And then by bringing rental prices down, then you allow people who work here to be able to live here, which means you reduce the demand for Section 8, government housing, government subsidized housing, studio apartment buildings, density, and so forth. So the idea behind cooling down the market is to take steps, the government can take steps to raise taxes as much as possible, preferably on people out of state, companies out of state, hedge funds that are buying real estate to rent it, to end, or let's say not end, but severely diminish that demand. And when you diminish that demand, that inventory comes back on the market. As that inventory comes back on the market, prices go down, rental prices go down, people can afford to live here, people can afford to buy houses here who live here, and there's not that pressure of all of the outside investment money, which is what has overheated the market in the first place, continuing to drive up the price, drive locals out of the area, and make density and the destruction of the small town culture and community inevitable. So I made that case in another video, but I just want to make that a little more clear here as far as cooling down the real estate market. The area doesn't have tons of apartments. And so if you don't have tons of apartments, especially low-end apartments, what happens is as that price, like I mentioned, it's probably about $23 an hour right now that somebody has to make in order to be able to live here. As that price goes up, that means the number of people working jobs in the area, which we want them to work. We want people working in restaurants. We want people, substitute teachers. We want teachers. We want people who are entry-level tradesmen, who are doing honest jobs, retail, hospitality, whatever it is. We want those people working here and we want them living here. So as that number goes higher from 23 to 25 to 30, the number of people who are going to need housing increases. So the demand is going to increase. And so the only way that number comes down is if the price of real estate and the rental market comes down. And so obviously it's my opinion that the government should get involved with taxes, especially on outside investment, out of state property owners and so forth, in order to make that possible, because otherwise the density, the traffic, the crime, the terrible schools, the government subsidized housing, your small business is going out of business, your local business is going out of business, is inevitable. So hopefully that adds a little clarity to it. The ideal is to tax people out of state as much as possible. But I'm not going to, I've said the whole time, I'm going to be honest. If you own 20 houses here and you're raising your rent 30% year over year, if I have anything to say about it, you will take a hit in how much money you're making. It's just the unfortunate reality, but that's to preserve the lifestyle. So theoretically, hopefully you understand that what you retain in lifestyle of living in an amazing place is worth the trade-off of some money. I don't want to put people out of business. I don't want realtors to go out of business, not make money, not make great lifestyles, not make great livings. I don't want to put developers or builders out of business, that sort of stuff. I'm not into putting people out of business, but I think it's important that everybody understands the trade-off that you're making. If the real estate market does not become affordable, density and the ruining of your small town becomes inevitable.